Good morning. I realized as I was sitting there that I forgot to put in my markers for when to change slides on my text, so you'll have to forgive me if I do a little searching around. What do you usually do for Thanksgiving, the holiday that we will celebrate as a nation on Thursday of this week? Maybe you think of turkey and mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes and marshmallows, gravy and stuffing. Maybe you think of family or friends around the table or games to be played together. Maybe you take a moment before a meal to name something for which you're grateful. Now, let's think about giving thanks with lowercase letters. What do you usually do for Thanksgiving? This week, we will be looking at fellowship offerings, or well-being offerings, or peace offerings. And one of their main functions was for the Israelites to have a way to give thanks to God. So I think it's worth thinking about for ourselves. How do we do thanksgiving to God? Before we jump into talking about fellowship offerings, though, I want to take a step back and look at Leviticus. I admit that I volunteered for this brief sermon series on offerings in Leviticus because I don't know much about it, and I wanted the opportunity to push me to learn more. Honestly, I don't think I'd even read through Leviticus as a whole since my college Old Testament class, which has been a little while. And I can't say I made it through the entire thing in my sermon preparation for today either. But I did learn some things in my preparations that made me actually want to read it. And so I want to take a bit to share that with you. How many of you maybe have read Leviticus in the last month, year, 5 years? I want to focus on a commentary that frames the drama of Leviticus, and yes, drama, as answering a question of the Psalms. So this is the commentary. It's called, "Who Shall Ascend the Mountain?" O Yahweh, who can abide in your tabernacle? Who may ascend your holy hill? In Exodus, at Mount Sinai, let me see where I'm at. Okay. Only Moses can go up to meet with God in the cloud. But when the tabernacle is set up by Moses, according to God's instructions at the very end of the book of Exodus, and God's presence comes down on it in the cloud, Moses himself cannot go in. We're left questioning, if even Moses can't go in to meet with God, who possibly could? How could the people of Israel meet with the Lord their God? Leviticus is set up to give an initial provisional answer. Speaking of Sinai, several commentators also note that it shares some structure with the tabernacle. The outer court, I don't think I can point with this, but in the bottom picture, it's on your right, is the outer courtyard, and then there's the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. And then the picture on the left has it more as it would have been set up, not just schematized. And then on the right is Mount Sinai, and we're going to talk through kind of these similarities. So the outer court with the altar corresponds to the base of the mountain, also with an altar. The second zone, partway up the mountain, where Aaron and the elders await Moses when he goes up, see if he's even going to come back alive, onto the holy place, accessed by the priesthood. The summit in the clouds corresponds to the Holy of Holies, the high priest's sole access. In Exodus, we've seen Moses, and only Moses, enter and meet with God, making then this issue of his failure to enter the tabernacle after God's presence fills it even more urgent. Michael Morales, in this book, says that there are two names for the tabernacle used in the Old Testament. The first, tabernacle, I think it's Mishkan or something like that, focuses on it as the place where God dwells with his people. The second word or phrase, place of meeting, focuses on it as a place where God can actually meet with his people. So Leviticus is set up to answer how we get from the first, God's presence merely being there with the people, to the second, God meeting with the people without them being consumed. Leviticus, he says, is the story of how Israel as a whole is to become a wonder, like the burning bush, burning with fire, but not consumed. A light with the glory of the presence of God. What a picture, right? What a picture for what we're to be like. The other piece that I loved learning about was how the Pentateuch as a whole, these first 5 books of Moses, is structured to lead to Leviticus of all things. I took this picture from the book, so I'm sorry it's not as bright as it maybe could be. But there are parallel pieces in Genesis, so that's up at the top of the screen, and in Deuteronomy down at the bottom. And you can see it's kind of forming this arrow, this leading up to Leviticus in the middle. So the parallel pieces talk about the separation from the nations, about blessing, seeing the land, descendants and the land. And then there's second parallel pieces between Exodus and Numbers. So Israel's desert journey, apostasy and plagues, Pharaoh and the magicians paralleling the whole episode in Numbers about Balak and Balaam, and the firstborn and Levites. And then it leads to Leviticus, which has its themes about sacrifices, cleanliness, holiness, and the tabernacle. And then Leviticus itself may be organized as a sort of literary tour of the tabernacle. So you kind of walk through where these different sacrifices would have taken place, what they would have looked like. It is at least set up as comprising God's speeches from the tabernacle. After Exodus talks about setting up the tabernacle, and then it's bookended by Numbers talk about taking the tabernacle down. So the whole book of Leviticus takes place at Sinai as God speaks. Within Leviticus itself, multiple commentators also see a structure leading up to a climax. So this is another way of thinking through the Pentateuch, and kind of, again, it's leading up to Leviticus. But the structure of Leviticus all leads up to the Day of Atonement, el Día de Perdón. So the Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, is what all of Leviticus is leading up to. And if the whole Pentateuch, those first 5 books, is leading up to Leviticus, then we start to see how central this concept is about reconciling God and man, opening a way back to the communion with God that was present in Eden, removing our sin that separates us as they sent that scapegoat into the wilderness. Who wouldn't want to read a book that tells us about how to get back to paradise, how to get back to the presence of God? Thus, he says, holiness is not an end in itself, but rather a means to an end, which is the real theme of Leviticus, the abundant life of joy with God in the house of God. So, the part of this structure that's set up for Israel to be able to meet with God and for God to dwell with them without consuming them are these 3 main offerings that we've been focusing on. The purification offerings, which Sarah covered, for cleansing, for forgiveness, the burnt offerings, which Phil covered, about consecration and wholehearted commitment. And now today we're talking about the fellowship offerings, or it could be translated peace or well-being, shalom type of offerings. The fellowship offerings are outlined with guidelines for them in 3 different places, in Leviticus 3, 7, and 9. They could be an ox, a ram, a goat, or a lamb. So it had to be an animal without defect, taken from one's own herds. Just like the other offerings we've talked about, you laid your hand on its head, identified with it, and identified it as your animal, and then you slaughtered it, and the blood was thrown against the sides of the altar. However, different from the other offerings, you took part in this offering, and also gave part of the offering of the meat to the right thigh and the breast to the priests. The fat and the internal organs were to be offered as a food offering to the Lord. Depending on why it was being offered, the remaining meat then had to be eaten within 1 to 2 days. Fellowship offerings could be done for different reasons. The word itself comes from the same root as shalom, meaning peace and wholeness. So it could be offered as an expression of thankfulness. Perhaps a harvest was particularly good, or one experienced deliverance from trouble, or God's protection. Offering a well-being or fellowship offering, and when it's done for thankfulness, it also included some grain products, loaves with oil and stuff, allowed for a feast involving meat, which would have been less common for the desert-dwelling Israelites. According to Leviticus 17, the animals that were sacrificable were only to be sacrificed at the sanctuary during their time in the desert. So if you wanted to eat meat, you had to give a fellowship offering. And what a way to make that a celebration, right, in the community. If you're not normally eating meat and then you have something to give thanks to God for, you get this feast, of meat that you don't normally get to eat. Makes it really special. There were prescriptions about eating the thankfulness offering the same day, meaning that one person's thankfulness transformed into a party that now led to others' thankfulness. A celebration of God's goodness inspires generosity to others who share in the feast, which then inspires their gratitude, and maybe they're going to be consequently generous, and so on. God's blessings were automatically set up to be shared in the celebration of those very blessings, leading to a communal, a group recognition of God's goodness. Of note, this system also sets up these generous tokens of appreciation from God's people to him at the times when his people can best afford them. They have something to give thanks for. I invite you to consider your own life and the thankfulness offerings. Is there something for which you can give thanks? One commentator shared this quote: "The opposite of joy is not sorrow, it is unbelief." If we believe in and truly reflect on God's work in redeeming our world and bringing his kingdom, in redeeming us through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, how can we not overflow with gratitude? Is there a way that you can allow God's generosity to you to push you to share his blessings? How can your gratitude overflow to bless others as well? How can your response to God, showing you his good, generous, just, merciful character, change the way that you respond to others? Another reason that fellowship offerings were done was for the fulfillment of a vow. Perhaps this could be a vow of commitment, of resources or service. Whatever the reason, keeping one's word in the vow resulted in a fellowship offering to God and the invitation to involve others in the celebration of one's faithfulness or fulfillment of duty. What vows could we celebrate as a community? How can we celebrate being faithful to one's word and commitments? The final reason for fellowship offerings was simply a free will or voluntary offering. It was a chance to give back to God and enjoy the offering by sharing it with others. It was a way for all Israel to be involved in the sacrificial rituals that allowed them to be in relationship with God. It was a predecessor, perhaps, of the Last Supper, the first early way that God shared a meal with the Israelites, him receiving the aroma from the burning fat and organs, and the Israelites enjoying the cooked meat. The nearness, with ongoing distance and separation involved, contrasts with how we interact with God today. It makes me all the more grateful for the act of Jesus' sacrifice that fulfilled all the sacrifices. When we celebrate communion with our communities today in gratitude, we remember his sacrifice. We give thanks. We encounter him in a much more intimate way. Reminds me that the Eucharist is sometimes what the the communion elements are called, and that verb in Greek actually means to give thanks. That is intricately involved in communion itself. We gather this week with family or friends to celebrate Thanksgiving. May it be a reminder to us of our ongoing need to give thanks. This doesn't mean that we need to ignore the ways that our world is still profoundly broken, or that we may be hurting or wounded ourselves. But it does mean that we can still find joy in the midst of these things. C.S. Lewis says, "All joy emphasizes our pilgrim status, always minds, beckons, awakens desire. Our best havings are wantings." As we reflect on our gratitude for what we have in food and shelter, in family and friends, in work and rest, may we also find that it points us back to a desire for more. May we find that our very gratitude for God's blessings make us want the blesser more. May we long to meet him in his dwelling place and find that we are not consumed. May we find that he can instead light our lives to lead others to him. Francis Schaeffer wrote, "One day all Christians will join in a doxology and sing God's praises with perfection. But even today, individually and corporately, we are not only to sing the doxology, but to be the doxology. May our lives be an offering of praise to the one who deserves it all."